Smoke rolled over cedar draw before them, thick and red-brown. And by the time it reached the ridge, 3 barns had already disappeared inside it. Then the flame came for one poor homestead on the Dakota grass. It should have taken the cabin first. It should have swallowed the hay shed, the wagon, lean-to, the little corral, and every scrap of winter feed the Hart family owned. Instead, the fire hit a pale ring of stripped earth and faltered. Inside that ring stood 38 ragged goats, coughing in the smoke, alive and confused, while the richest men in the draw watched their own roofs burn behind them. 2 months earlier, everyone had laughed when Caleb Hart spent his last cattle money on those goats. Ruth Hart did not laugh. She stood beside him at the sale pen, watching the animals chew bark from the rails, and said, "A thing can look poor in fair weather and still be the very thing that keeps you alive." Caleb wanted cattle. Every man in Cedar Draw wanted cattle. Cattle meant respect. Cattle meant credit at the store. Cattle meant a man's name carried weight when he walked into town. Goats meant something had gone wrong. They were narrow in the ribs, sharp in the knees, and bold enough to climb into the feed wagon before the seller had finished talking. One had a torn ear. Another had a crooked horn that curled like a question mark. They looked less like livestock than a prank the Prairie had played on desperate people, but they were cheap. Caleb had come west with a team, a plow, a stove, and the kind of hope that turns hard when the rain fails. His claim lay north of Cedar Draw, 160 acres of short grass, chokecherry brush, greasewood, and stone. The cabin was small but tight. The barn was nothing handsome, but he had built it beam by beam with hands split from winter cold. Beside it stood their real fortune, a stack of blue-joint hay packed high under a pole roof. If that hay survived, they might survive the winter. If it did not, the whole claim would become nothing but another abandoned square on the map. By May, their savings had thinned to the bottom of a tobacco tin. A proper herd was beyond reach. Even a handful of yearlings would leave them with no seed money, no repairs, and no room for bad luck. Then a failed freighter south of town offered 38 brush gokoots for less than the price of 2 good steers. Caleb hated the idea before Ruth finished saying it. The goats were ugly. Worse than ugly, they were public. Jasper Lyle made sure of that. Lyle owned the largest hay meadow in the draw, a white-painted house, a grain scale, and enough notes on small claims to make men lower their voices when he entered the mercantile. He had offered twice to buy the Hart place for mercy money, and each time Caleb had refused. When Lyle heard about the goats, he rode out just to enjoy himself. He sat his horse at the gate, looked across the yard at the thin animals gnawing a fence post, and smiled. "Caleb," he said, "a man buys cattle when he means to rise. He buys goats when he has already started falling. The men with him laughed. Caleb said nothing. His face went still in the dangerous way quiet men have. Ruth only watched the goats. She watched them rip dry greasewood down to bare sticks. She watched them strip thistle heads without flinching. She watched them chew the brittle weed chaff packed against the barn wall, the very trash Caleb cursed every time it caught in a hinge or clogged a wheel. They ignored what cows would have wanted. They went straight for what nobody valued. By the end of the first week, the yard looked different. Not prettier, never that, but cleaner in a strange, hard way. The brush nearest the smokehouse had been bitten back. The weeds along the root cellar vanished. Bare patches showed through the yellow grass. Ruth noticed first. "They are eating the trouble," she said. Caleb looked up from mending harness. "They are eating everything." "No," she said. "Not everything. The dry stuff. The dead stuff. The things a fire would take first." That was when the old sheep herder came. His name was Ned Calder, and he arrived at sundown with a limp, a bedroll, and 40 years of weather folded into his face. He had heard, as everyone had, that the Harts had bought goats and shame in the same bargain. Unlike everyone else, he did not laugh. He stood by the fence for a long time, watching the animals work through a patch of thorn and sage. Then he said, "You two know what you've got?" Caleb almost apologized. Ruth did not. "What have we got?" she asked. Ned pointed with his pipe stem. "A fire that eats before the fire comes." That sentence changed the summer. Ned had spent half his life moving sheep and goats through dry country, and he knew what brush could do when a hot wind found it. A prairie fire did not need a forest. It needed a ladder. Dry grass to weeds, weeds to brush, brush to wall, wall to roof. "Take the ladder away," he said, "and flame has to crawl. Make it crawl across dirt, and you may live long enough to fight the sparks." He told them to clear a belt around the buildings, wide and clean. Not a pretty yard, not a mowed strip, a true break. Dirt, bitten stubble, and no standing fuel. Wider to the west because the wind came from there. Cleanest near the hay because hay burned like money soaked in lamp oil. "How wide?" Caleb asked. Ned spat into the dust. "Wider than pride thinks necessary." That night, Ruth and Caleb walked the yard by lantern light. The cabin, the barn, the hay shed, the wagon lean-to, the corral, all of it sat in a bowl of cured grass and brush. What had looked like ordinary prairie in April now looked like kindling arranged by a patient enemy. Caleb drew a ring in the dirt with a nail. Ruth made it larger with her boot. They began before sunrise. The goats did not become useful by accident. They had to be made useful. Left alone, they wandered wherever they pleased, and wherever they pleased was usually the wrong direction. So Caleb drove iron stakes and stretched a sliding line between them. Ruth tied short leads from that line, spacing the goats like a crooked row of saw teeth. They bawled, they twisted, they tangled themselves into knots so insulting that Caleb nearly threw his hat into the creek bed. Then hunger won. The goats lowered their heads and began. They took the greasewood first, cracking the brittle twigs between their teeth. They ate the dry seed heads. They stripped the brush low. They nosed under old tumbleweed and pulled the hidden grass out by the roots. What Caleb would have needed, a scythe, a rake, and a week of misery to clear. The goats reduced in an afternoon. Ruth learned faster than anyone. She learned that water kept them settled. She learned that shade made them lazy. She learned that a lump of salt could pull the whole flock through brush they had tried to avoid 10 minutes earlier. She would set the salt pan on the far side of a dangerous patch, then stand back and watch 38 goats eat a road toward it. Caleb built brush hurdles out of the very limbs they cleared. At first, he cursed them as weak fences. Then he understood. The hurdles did not need to stop a cow. They only needed to persuade a goat that some other path was less annoying. Day by day, the eaten brush became the tool that shaped the next day's eating. The work looked ridiculous. That was Lyle's favorite part. He rode by twice in June and once brought men from town just to point. There, he called from the road, is modern agriculture. Salt, string, and barnyard rats with horns. The men laughed so hard one of them choked. Caleb kept moving stakes. Ruth kept filling the water tub. The ring widened. At first it was only a scar around the barn. Then it became a path, then a belt, then a raw, ugly moat of pale dirt circling everything they could not afford to lose. The western side gave them the worst fight. There the brush grew taller, tangled with dead stems from 3 dry seasons. Ned had warned them about that side. Fire would not politely arrive from wherever the yard was cleanest. It would come with the wind, and the wind came out of the west. Caleb cut the tallest brush by hand until his palms bled through the cloth he had wrapped around them. Ruth dragged the limbs to the hurdles. The goats cleaned what the axe left behind. By late July, the western break stretched nearly 170 feet from the barn wall to the first standing brush. The neighbors said the Hart place looked skinned. They were right. It looked poor. It looked foolish. It looked like a family had scraped value off its own land. But there was a truth in that stripped ring that laughter could not see. They were not feeding goats. They were starving a fire. By August, the country had gone beyond dry. Dry was too soft a word. The creek shrank to black puddles under flies. Wagon wheels raised powder that hung in the air after the wagon had passed. The grass had lost its gold and turned the gray-yellow color of old rope. Even the laughter changed. Men still mocked the goats, but now they did it louder than necessary, as if sound could push fear away. Jasper Lyle came one last time before the fire. He found Caleb repairing a break in the west hurdle, while Ruth counted goats at the salt pan. "You have wasted the summer," Lyle said. "No extra hay, no garden worth naming, no cattle. Just a dirt necklace and 38 mouths that give nothing back." Caleb did not answer. Lyle leaned forward in the saddle. "When winter comes, you'll sell. Only by then I won't be paying a May price." Ruth stepped to the gate before Caleb could speak. "Mr. Lyle," she said, "have your men cleared the brush behind your hay barn?" His smile hardened. "My hay barn does not need advice from a woman who herds goats with table salt." "No," Ruth said quietly. "It needs space." The smile left him. Then he laughed, because pride had no other place to go. Ned Calder rode away 2 days later, heading east to live with a daughter whose letter had finally caught him. Before he left, he walked the Hart ring from end to end, testing it with old eyes. "Good west side," he said. "Clean near the hay. Watch that low strip by the barn corner. It wants one more pass." Caleb glanced at the sky. "I'll put them there tomorrow." Ned nodded, but his face stayed grave. "A break stops flame on the ground," he said. "It does not stop sparks in the air. If fire comes under wind, wet the roof. Soak the hay face. Kill every ember that lands inside. The ring gives you a chance. It does not do the fighting for you." Then he left them with the sentence Ruth would hear in her sleep: "The fire will look for the one thing you missed." It came on August 13th. The day began wrong. Not stormy, not dramatic, worse than that. Still hot and brass-colored, with a southwest wind that did not gust so much as press one long hand against the world. By noon, Ruth smelled smoke. Not cook smoke, not chimney smoke. Grass smoke. She stepped from the cabin with a basin in her hands and saw a brown column folding upward beyond the west ridge. For half a breath, she could not move. Then the wind brought the sound, a low, living rush. Caleb came out of the barn already running. They did not waste time deciding whether Ned had been right. They moved as if they had been rehearsing for weeks, because they had. First, the goats. Ruth and Caleb drove all 38 into the tight east corral, the barest ground inside the ring. The animals fought the smoke and each other, but the gate held. Then the roof. Caleb climbed with a bucket rope while Ruth hauled water from the well until her shoulders burned. They soaked the cabin shakes, then the barn roof, then the windward face of the hay. They dragged loose hay away from the base with rakes and bare hands. Ruth threw wet quilts over the wagon tongue and the feed boxes. Caleb kicked every scrap of wood and straw away from the barn wall. The sky turned copper. Ash began to fall. Across the draw, Bells rang and men shouted. Horses screamed. Someone fired a rifle 3 times, the old alarm signal, though by then every living thing in Cedar Draw already knew. The fire came over the ridge as a wall. It was not tall everywhere. It did not need to be. The grass itself seemed to stand up and burn forward, a racing skin of orange with black smoke rolling over it. Wherever it found brush, it climbed. Wherever it found fence, it ran. Wherever it found a haystack, it exploded into light. Ruth saw the first neighbor's barn catch, then another. Then the big roof of Jasper Lyle's west shed vanished behind sparks. There was no time to think about justice, no time to be glad, no time even to be afraid in a clean way. Fear became work, work became breath. An ember landed on the barn roof and died in a hiss. Another landed in the dirt ring and spun like an angry insect until it went black. A third found a clump of grass by the barn corner, the strip Ned had warned them about. The flame took it instantly. It ran low and quick, not more than a hand high at first, but it ran in the one direction it had been waiting all summer to run, straight toward the barn wall. Ruth shouted Caleb's name. He saw it and threw himself down on it with a wet grain sack. The fire bit around the sack's edge. Ruth poured the last bucket across the strip. Steam jumped. Caleb kicked dirt over the living orange, then beat it again and again until the sack smoked in his hands. For one terrible moment, the flame held. Then it failed, not because Caleb was stronger than fire, because the goats had left it almost nothing. The burning strip ended in dirt on both sides, choked on its own smallness, and died 6 feet from the barn wall. Then the main fire hit the western break. Ruth never forgot the sound it made. It was like a crowd taking in one breath. The flame leaned forward across the bare ground, reaching for fuel that was no longer there. It licked at dust, guttered, and dropped. It split around the Hart place in 2 angry streams, running north and south along the edge of the cleared belt, hunting for grass, finding it outside the ring, and racing past. Inside the ring, smoke twisted, goats bawled, water dripped from the cabin roof, but the building stood. Caleb sank to his knees in the dirt, black-faced and shaking, still gripping the ruined grain sack. Ruth looked at the pale ring, then at the wall of fire moving away on both sides. They couldn't see it, she whispered. Caleb's voice came out hoarse. See what? She looked at the goats, huddled and wild-eyed in the corral. We already made the fire hungry. By nightfall, the fire burned itself against the river bottoms east of the draw. By morning, the world beyond the Hart Ring was black. Fence lines lay as thin gray trails. Brush piles smoked. Posts glowed red in their holes. A milk cow wandered through ash with singed hair along her flank. Men rode slowly, hats low, faces blank with the math of what had been lost. 5 barns were gone, 2 hay sheds, miles of fence, nearly all of Lyle's winter feed. No one in the draw had died, and that mercy was spoken of first. But after mercy came winter, and winter did not care that a man was grateful to be alive. Winter asked what he would feed. The Hart place stood in the middle of the damage, like a mistake the fire had made. The cabin stood, the barn stood, the hay stood, blackened on the west face, but solid beneath. The goats, released after sunrise, walked to the edge of the ring and began nosing the ash, as if looking for breakfast in the ruins of their own reputation. People came to stare. They did not come in groups at first. Pride arrived one rider at a time. A man would rein up at the clean line where black earth met pale dirt, look from the burned prairie to the standing barn, and then look at the goats. No one laughed. Mrs. Alder, whose hay shed had burned to its stone footings, was the first to speak plain. She came in a wagon with 2 children beside her, and a face held together by will. "I won't ask for charity," she said, "but I will ask how you made the ring." Caleb turned to Ruth. Ruth opened the gate. "We will show you," she said, "and we will bring the goats." So they did. For the rest of August and into September, the Harts drove their ridiculous flock from claim to claim. They taught neighbors how to stretch a sliding line, how to place salt beyond the brush instead of beside it, how to build hurdles from cut limbs, how to widen the west side, how to scrape the last stubborn plants by hand, and how to stop confusing a neat yard with a safe one. The goats became famous and remained unimpressed. They climbed wag-wag. They stole laundry. The crooked-horned doe learned to open a loose latch and led a midnight escape into a turnip patch. Children who had once been told to stay away from the Hart place now begged to carry salt pans. Jasper Lyle came after the first frost. He did not bring men with him. He stopped at the gate and looked at the ring for a long time. The burned country behind him had not yet healed. Without hay, he had been forced to sell cattle into a market full of other desperate sellers. His big house still stood, but the certainty around him had burned off. "I was wrong," he said. Caleb waited. Lyle swallowed. "I called it foolishness because I did not understand it. Then I called it foolishness because I was afraid I should have." Ruth said nothing, but her eyes stayed on him. He looked toward the goats, who were busy destroying a patch of dead weeds by the fence. "I need that done around my place before next season," he said. "I will pay." Caleb could have named any price. The draw would have approved. So would pride. Instead, he opened the gate. "We will bring them," he said. "Pay feed while they work. That will do." Lyle looked at him as if forgiveness were the one bargain he had never learned how to price. That winter was hard. No kindness made it easy. But the draw survived it better together than it would have survived apart. Families with hay shared what they could. Families with teams hauled for those without. The Harts sent 2 wagon loads from their scorched stack to the alders, and word of that shamed richer men into doing the same. In spring, green returned slowly through the black. Caleb bought 26 thin cattle from a neighbor who had to reduce his herd. Not the grand herd he had dreamed of, not the kind that makes men step aside in town, but enough, and he kept the goats. A year after the fire, Ruth stood at the same gate where Jasper Lyle had once laughed and watched the flock work, the outer edge of the firebreak. The cabin had a new sill. The barn wore fresh boards on the west wall where the flame had scorched it. Beyond the ring, grass moved in the wind again. Around nearly every homestead in Cedar Draw, a pale belt of cleared earth now circled the buildings. The draw had learned to see what laughter had hidden. Caleb came up beside her, carrying a salt pan in one hand. The crooked-horned doe stood on the woodpile as if she had personally negotiated the weather. Ruth smiled. "They still look like trouble," Caleb said. "They are," Ruth answered. "The useful kind." Then she looked across the ring, across the grass toward the ridge where the fire had first appeared. A thing's value, she had learned, is not decided by how it looks when the sky is clear. It is decided by what it saves when the world catches fire.